Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, South Africa has been taken off a global watchdog's dirty money list, providing a boost for increased foreign investment in the continent's largest economy. The Paris-based Financial Action Task Force said that South Africa, along with Nigeria, Mozambique and Burkina Faso, is no longer on the list of jurisdictions subject to increased monitoring. Well, this comes with just under 4 weeks left before the G20 Leaders Summit is set to occur here in Nasrec, Johannesburg. That is very good timing ahead of South Africa closing off its presidency within the G20. Joining me now to take this discussion forward, I'd like to welcome political economist Dr. Dale Mckinley. Dr. Mckinley, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Yes, thank you, Faraz, and thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Dr. Mckinley, I want to start off with the timing of this. I mean, South Africa were put on this grey list 2 years ago. How important was the timing of South Africa being removed from this, given that we are, of course, just less than 3 weeks away from that G20 Leaders Summit?
Yeah, look, I don't know if there was any direct correlation between, obviously, the G20, but yes, you're right. It happened to be fairly decent timing. And I mean, this was coming. I think this was to be expected. Those who have been paying attention to when we got onto this grey list a couple of years ago will know that SARS, in particular, our National Treasury, had taken these things very seriously and had started a whole series of reforms that had been identified by the task force that needed to happen. And so there was I think, a palpable sense of relief, certainly from Treasury and others. But I think we also, sometimes these things are a little bit overblown, and we might be able to talk about why the case is that these task forces have outsized influence within our economy. While it's a positive development, I think there's a need for us to critically look at how these things actually take place and who are the people that get grey listed and why they do so.
Yeah. Dr. Mckinley, before I go to the next question, there's that follow-up, and there's something important that you mentioned, the influence of the Financial Task Force. Is it as simple as just saying that they have this influence, we as a country need to accept it, and when they decide to take South Africa off the grey list, hippie hooray, a potential investment can come back into the country? So how much does this influence from outside of the country really play a role in the way we function as an economy?
Yeah, I think they play what I call an outsized role. I want to give an example of some of the viewers who might know, credit agencies. So you'll know that there was a big deal made when we get lowered, our credit agency lowers to a B or a C or whatever it is. And this has huge implications. The problem is that with the task force, which is identifying understandable deficiencies that we have as a country in terms of countering money laundering and the terrorist financing of so-called terrorist groups. The problem is that the Financial Task Force is accountable to nobody. It doesn't really have a democratic mandate to do it. It's an independent body, which countries buy into to some extent and say, yes, we agree on this agenda. But when they make these pronouncements and when they have this list, it has very real life consequences for our economies in terms of credit, in terms of investment, in terms of a range of things. And the question that many are asking with these bodies is, well, in whose interests are they doing these things? Is it simply as a good governance issue? Is it simply just because everyone agrees? Or are there a little bit more of a political and economic agenda at play here? Because it seems as though most of the countries that are targeted are in the global south as opposed to the north.
Yeah, no, and I mean, the list that I've mentioned there, most of them, of course, are within the global south. Dr. Mckinley, how much of this decision reflects a genuine reform that we're seeing in the country vis-a-vis that of political lobbying or external pressure? Of course, we've spoken about the external pressure part with the Financial Task Force, but within the country itself, where do we see it from that regards when we talk of reform versus, of course, political lobbying, I beg your pardon?
Sure. So I think, look, nobody in South Africa is going to argue that we don't need to improve. For example, let's see where the weaknesses were. For example, banking oversight. If everyone remembers the state capture years, when there was lots of money flowing through banks and nobody knew where it was going, there wasn't proper oversight. And that regulatory authority over the banks and making sure that banking employees as well are trained to identify suspicious transactions and other kinds of things. These are necessary and real. And so these are institutional reforms that we needed to make. We also needed to make institutional reforms to our prosecutorial authorities and our law enforcement agencies. We don't have to be convinced, listening to the Madlanga Commission and other things that are going on, that we've got some serious, serious problems. So these are also institutional reforms that go way beyond politics of the external, but are internal to our own economy and our politics, which need to happen. I think where sometimes the political pressure comes on is to say that all of these things are for foreign direct investment. In other words, you're doing this for people coming to bring money into the country. But fundamentally, if we think about it, these actually, if we allow criminal syndicates, for example, to infiltrate our institutions, then it's ordinary citizens that suffer on a real day basis. It's not just about foreign investors and big investments. It's about everyday life and the prices and the safety and security that we feel as citizens.
Dr. McKinley, South Africa, of course, originally they were put on this list due to its weakness in combating financial crimes. My question is twofold. Have these weaknesses been addressed? Because obviously we don't see it, but we'd like to think that Treasury has found a way to go ahead and address these weaknesses, or are we just seeing superficial compliance efforts? Because they're two different aspects to it, but they speak to the same issue that the FTAF had put South Africa on.
Look, I think there have been some serious reforms. There were some gaps in the legislative arena, which were closed, which is good in terms of our legislation to make it much tighter, the oversight. The regulatory, for example, I don't know how many viewers know, but we have what's called a Financial Intelligence Center, which is a governmental body that is supposed to oversee banks and financial transactions. It hasn't been playing its role. It hasn't been doing its job in fully. And to strengthen it, to capacitate it, to resource it, which Treasury has done, it's a good thing that this is happening way beyond just the Financial Action Task Force, but for the security of our own citizenry and in terms of our banking system and otherwise. I think the other thing that is where we've just begun and where we need to go much, much further is with the prosecutorial authorities. One of the weaknesses identified was that there's not many cases being brought against those that are found to be guilty of certain crimes or certain illegal transactions. And this is what many citizens are really frustrated about, is across the board, is that when we see people commit crimes and do bad things, there seems to be very little consequence. So I think that's the area that still has a lot of room for improvement. But there are some real reforms that have been taken. I think it's early days. And it's not about pleasing the Financial Task Force. I think it's about increasing and strengthening our democracy and our oversight institutions that will benefit the majority of South Africans.
Yeah, I was going to come to the next question before we go to the break, Dr. McKinley, because, watching the Madlanga Commission, you just see, how exposed the criminal justice system within the country is. And when you listen to Advocate Shamila Batoy, who heads, of course, the NPA, she is crying out for assistance from Treasury in terms of budget to go ahead and prosecute various forms of criminality within this country. And again, therein lies the problem, doesn't it? That as much as we'd like to say this is a turning point, when you listen to the Madlanga Commission, when you listen to the NPA, it's very hard to put a case forward to say that the criminal justice system within South Africa is on the right track.
Yeah, it is a difficult argument to make. But I think that if one looks at where we were in 2017, 2016, where we are, there has been some improvement. I mean, it's even if it's not as much as we would, or nearly as fast as we would have liked it to be, I think there has been a degree of improvement. And but this is where the Achilles heel, so to speak, the really weakness in our system is. We have very good laws, generally speaking. We have more than a competent capacity in state, but we don't put the right people in the right places. And I think this is where, you talked about Shamila Batoy. One of her biggest complaints is that, you can have a strategy and you can have cases, but if you don't have the proper people in there to actually, go after them and do the investigations, and you have the financial resources to do so. So I think it's a budgetary question as well as a capacitation and governance question. And these are very deep-seated challenges in our society that go way beyond getting off a gray list. This goes to the heart of whether or not the state itself and this capturing by these interests and particularly criminal syndicates, if we can turn this thing around. I think we're heading in a fairly positive direction. We're going far too slow, and the push is not nearly there. But it's going to be up to, and this is, I always say this, it's not just a matter of us sitting here and complaining and pointing out the problems, but the citizenry themselves. We have local government elections coming up. We have participatory democracy in our country. Let's take those opportunities to make that agenda much, much more quicker and much more real in the context of improving the governance as well as the institutional framework of our country.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Dr. Mckinley. We're going to be asking the question, what does this mean to the resident of Mthatha, KwaMashu, the various rural areas in this country, the townships of South Africa? You know, what does it mean for somebody living in Sandton or Camps Bay or Mhlanga? The reason why I'm bringing this is because it affects the different aspects of society in terms of whether this can help a citizen of South Africa in terms of its pockets and them tackling, or South Africa tackling, the inequality, the high inequality we have in this country. My conversation continues after this break. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with political economist Dr. Dale Mckinley. Again, thank you so much for staying with us, Dr. Mckinley. Dr. Mckinley, many citizens, would have probably read Friday's news and said, okay, great news, we're off the grey list, but how does this affect my life? How does this affect the high unemployment in this country? How does this affect the GDP growth in this country? And of course, in these weeks now leading up to the G20 Leaders Summit, we're going to be hearing various stakeholders and political figures saying, well, this will allow for it to happen. In the view of Dr. Dale Mckinley, will this development that we saw impact ordinary South Africans in a positive way?
To some extent it will, but it's not the silver bullet. It's not something, I would agree with you that this is oftentimes overplayed. You sort of say, well, we're off the grey list, hurrah, here we go, we're going to grow our economy, we're going to get foreign investments and so forth. That's a much, much deeper challenge. But I think there are some positive aspects to what has happened. And let me give you an example for the ordinary person in the street, in the township, in our cities and small towns. So, for example, if we have a situation where there's lots of criminal syndicates that are operating through our banks that are laundering money, where we have organizations that are considered to be violent or terrorist organizations that are doing the same, and we stay on this kind of gray list, irrespective of some of the agendas behind that, the problem would be is that first, borrowing becomes more expensive. Now, as you know, anyone paying attention to our budget will know that our borrowing costs are going up. And so we borrow quite a bit of money on the market, both private as well as bilaterally. And it would increase because those who lend us the money would say it's a bit more riskier to earn that money. So we're going to charge you higher interest rates, and we're going to charge you more, more for doing this. And what that does is that has a knock-on effect. Because what does government do? It passes on those costs in terms of services, prices, taxes, everything else in order to recoup. So we're going to feel higher prices. The other thing, of course, is that because of the gray listing, there'll be possibly some people that would otherwise invest in our economy, whether that's domestically or internationally, that would hold back and say, whoa, I'm going to wait and see because it's not predictable. And obviously this would have impact on possibly creation of jobs, investment into bilateral agreements and development aid to our country, our government, in relation to the creation of particularly medium and small scale enterprises. So a lot of these things would have knock-on impacts. And I haven't even mentioned the other thing, which is example, prices. So the basic food prices, basic transportation prices, other things, as we can see, fluctuate according to things that happen oftentimes beyond our control. For example, the oil price or the cost of borrowing. So these things have real impact in the wallets of ordinary people.
Dr. Mckinley, right now, President Cyril Ramaphosa is in Switzerland, but prior to that, of course, he toured Southeast Asia. This was, of course, on the back of the grey list announcement. And, of course, this would have given him a sort of extra ammunition to go to that part of the world and say, well, hey, we're off the grey list. Come invest in our country. Again, I have to mention the G20 aspect of this, but this is going to help South Africa in terms of investor confidence, won't it?
Yes, to some extent it will. It'll send a positive message. There are investors that pay attention to these things, and shareholders are always times saying where's the maximum return. Well, in South Africa, this would assist possibly in making people make more positive decisions. But I wouldn't overplay that, because fundamentally you can see from our world right now where there's much conflict, there's much uncertainty and much unpredictability, both politically and economically. Capital itself, international capital and others, will go wherever there's money to be made, irrespective of what the situation is. It might be better for them if there's certainty, as in this case, or if there are better conditions, but it shouldn't be seen as something that, oh my goodness, we're off the gray list and all of a sudden this is going to just massively flow. But it is a boon for the president and for the GNU, because what they can do, as you mentioned, is now to say to the world, look, we're heading in the right direction. This discourse about Africa falling and us bad governance and we're not doing the things and we're all corrupt and so forth, Afro-pessimism is nonsense. We're moving in the right direction. Look, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Mozambique, so forth and so on. So it's a good publicity as well as a good sort of reputational move on their part. But in terms of the practical economy, it's going to take much, much more than getting off the grey list for us to move forward in a more meaningful way. Yeah,
you mentioned, of course, the government of national unity. I would like to think that political parties and, of course, the African National Congress, welcomed this announcement. But I guess both you and I know, Dr. McKinley, when it comes to politicians, they will take this as a victory on their part. But let's just say they take it from their part, but is there also an institutional victory given Friday's announcement?
Excuse me, I think, excuse me.
No problem.
Oh, I just got a bug in my throat.
No, it's fine, no problem.
Whew, okay. So I think that yes, institutionally, I think particularly our national treasury will want to get some kudos for this, because they've worked hard. And they have done things, I think, in a professional and meaningful way. So one could say that we have improved some of our financial architecture. We've closed some of the gaps. It is a win for government. This was a big thing. Capital made a big thing of it. If you remember, when we got onto the gray list, all the media was like, oh my gosh, we're on the gray list. This is really bad. So now that we're off the gray list, they must be consistent with that perspective and give credit where credit's due. In that context, and that means that there has been some institutional progress in that regard. But once again, just to caution that institutional progress is the first steps. This is not something that is going to lead to, as I said, to this massive investment or massive growth or employment opportunities. We have deep structural problems in our economy that require domestic and national solutions and answers. It's not going to come from the Financial Action Task Force and a grey list.
One final question, Dr. McKinley. How does South Africa make sure that this does not happen again? And what are the key risks that South Africa, especially the financial institutions in this country, mainly National Treasury, need to make sure that South Africa is not back on this grey list again, and this longevity that we saw the grey list South Africa was part of, the 2 years that we're not back on it again? Because again, this is an economy that is trying to grow. It's trying to get it to that 3% GDP growth, and being back on the grey list is not going to help anytime in the future.
No, it won't. And I think the key to not going back on this grey list is to not only to sustain the reforms that have been made and to make sure that they are followed through, but to financially capacitate those reforms. Government's going to have to bite the bullet. It's going to have to shift some of its resources to these kinds of things in order for it to put its money where its mouth is, so to speak. So you can have the institutional reform. You can say, look, we've done that. We passed the legislation. But if you don't give the means, for example, the National Prosecuting Authority to bring on board a range of new investigators, if you don't give the Financial Intelligence Center the means to go after the banks and to do the necessary forensic investigations that can uncover some of the malfeasance, then it's just hot air. So I think in that sense, there's a need for a budgetary commitment, but there's also a need for a political commitment to really turn around our capacitation of our state. And this is where our state has been hollowed out. in many cases over the last 10 years. People, we've seen in our own here where I live in Johannesburg, one simply has to look at the healthcare system and the state that it's in, or the water, the state that it's in. So this goes way beyond simply about financial transactions. It's about capacitating the state and putting the right people in the right place to do a public service, to do a particular professional job. When you put political appointees, when you have patronage and networks, you open the space for corruption, you open the space for criminal syndicates to come in, and we would get back onto, in fact, it's not just the gray list, we could get onto the black list, which is the really bad one, if we were to backslide into this kind of sort of, how should we say, a mafia state in many ways. And we are, as the Madlanga Commission is showing, there are elements that want us to go there. There are real possibilities that we can undermine our state institutions through this. So we need the politicians and the political parties, and our government needs to take this very seriously. This is not a political game. This is about the future of our country.
Dr. Dale Mckinley, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
That's Dr. Dale Mckinley, political economist, just breaking down the pros of being removed from the grey list, but also cautiously showing government that, yes, we're off the grey list, but what about South Africa itself? What about fixing the domestic issues? For example, the water crisis that we have in this country, infrastructure that we have in this country, the construction mafia who continue to run riot with regards to the work that they're doing to stop growth within this country, but most importantly, keeping an eye on what we're seeing in the Madlanga Commission, fixing South Africa's criminal justice system. All of that needs to be solved in order to make sure that South Africa's economy has progressive growth to it. Well, that's all we have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. If you've missed today's episode, you'll be sure to find it on our YouTube channel. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.